The woman who once walked out on Nathan Whitmore was now running after his car, as if the sound of his engine could take the last piece of her pride with it. In the underground parking level of the Langford Hotel in downtown Chicago, rainwater slipped down the concrete ramp in thin silver lines, carrying the glow of red brake lights across the floor. Ava Collins moved too fast for the heels she had chosen that evening. They had looked perfect under the chandeliers upstairs, sharp and elegant beneath her black dress, but now each step cracked through the hollow garage like a confession arriving late. Her short blonde hair clung lightly to her temples, damp from the storm blowing in through the open entrance behind her. She held one hand against her chest, not because she was hurt, but because something inside her had begun to collapse the moment Nathan turned away from her in that ballroom without anger, without pleading, without even the smallest sign that she still had the power to wound him. Ahead of her, a Blacktown car waited beside a row of polished columns. The driver had already opened the rear door. Nathan stood beside it in a tailored charcoal suit, his dark tie still perfectly centered, his short brown hair neat despite the wet wind moving through the garage. He looked the way he had looked on the day their divorce became final, calm to the point of cruelty, except now the calm was different. Back then, she had mistaken it for defeat. Tonight, under the low fluorescent lights and the soft purr of an expensive engine, she understood it had been discipline. Ava stopped several feet from him, breathing hard, the sound small and uneven in the wide concrete space. For a second, she could not find the woman she had been upstairs, the woman who had entered the gala on Brandon Hayes' arm believing she had upgraded her life. That woman had smiled for cameras, touched the rim of a champagne flute, and let Brandon introduce her as though she were part of his polished success. That woman had believed Nathan belonged in the past, somewhere behind closed apartment doors and quiet dinners and the ordinary tenderness she once called boring. Then the host had stepped onto the stage and announced the name of the evening's principal donor, the CEO of Whitmore Capital Group, and the entire room had risen before Nathan even finished walking into the light. Ava still remembered the silence that fell through her body when she saw him. Not the Nathan she had left behind, not the man she accused of lacking ambition, but a man whose name made bankers straighten their jackets and city officials extend both hands. He had nodded to the crowd with quiet restraint, as if applause were weather and he had learned not to lean into storms. When his eyes briefly found hers, there was no revenge in them. That was what ruined her. If he had smiled cruelly, she could have hated him. If he had ignored her completely, she could have called him bitter. But he had looked at her with polite distance, the way a man looks at a locked. 6 months earlier, the room where their marriage ended was so white and quiet that even the clock seemed careful about making noise. It was on the 17th floor of a glass office building in downtown Chicago, where the windows looked out over gray morning traffic and the Chicago River moved below like a strip of cold steel. Ava Collins sat on one side of the polished conference table with her short blonde hair tucked behind one ear, her coat folded neatly over the chair beside her, and a look on her face that tried very hard to be freedom. Nathan Whitmore sat across from her in a plain navy suit, his tie dark, his hands still, his wedding ring catching the pale light each time he moved his fingers. Between them lay a stack of papers, clean and final, the kind of papers that turned years of dinners, birthdays, apologies, and shared grocery lists into signatures and dates. Ava did not look at him when the attorney slid the pen toward her. She looked at the document as if it were a locked door, and she had finally found the key. For months, she had told herself this was the brave thing to do. She had repeated it in the mirror while putting on mascara, whispered it to friends over brunch in Lincoln Park, and let Brandon Hayes say it out loud in expensive restaurants. You deserve more. You deserve a man with vision. You deserve a life that feels larger than this. By the time she signed her name, the sentence had become part of her posture. Nathan watched the black ink move beneath her hand, smooth and confident. He had always noticed little things about her, even then. The way her jaw tightened when she was trying not to show doubt. The way her left thumb pressed against her palm when she wanted to appear certain. The way she exhaled after the last letter of her name as though she had just crossed a finish line. She pushed the pen toward him without meeting his eyes. Nathan picked it up, read the final page once, and signed where the yellow marker told him to sign. No pause. No argument. No performance of heartbreak. That calmness bothered Ava more than begging would have. She wanted him to protest, to ask what he could change, to finally display the urgency she had accused him of lacking. Instead, he placed the pen down with quiet precision and folded his hands. The attorney cleared his throat and began explaining the division of assets, but Ava barely listened. Nathan had already agreed to leave her the apartment near West Loop, the car, most of their shared savings, and several pieces of furniture she had chosen during the marriage. It sounded generous. It sounded weak. At least, that was how Ava chose to understand it. She glanced at him then, searching for the man she had once loved and finding only a face too composed to satisfy her anger. "You are not even going to fight for anything," she said softly. Nathan looked at her for the first time that morning. His eyes were tired, but not empty. "I did fight, Ava," he said, "just not in ways you respected." The words landed quietly, and because they were quiet, she dismissed them. She gathered her purse, stood, and smoothed the front of her cream blouse as if rising from a business meeting instead of the end of a life. "Maybe that is the problem," she replied. "You were always too safe, too careful, too comfortable being ordinary." The attorney lowered his eyes to the papers. Outside, a horn sounded from the street far below. Nathan did not defend himself. He did not tell her about the calls he took after midnight, the contract signed under a holding company she never cared to ask about, the private office on the top floor of a building she had passed a dozen times without knowing his name was behind the glass. He did not tell her that the apartment, the car, the savings, all of it was not surrender. It was the last kindness he knew how to give someone who had mistaken his silence for emptiness. Instead, he slipped the wedding ring from his finger, held it for one brief second, and placed it on the table between them. The small circle of gold made almost no sound against the wood. Ava looked at it and felt a flicker of something she refused to name. Then she turned toward the door. By the time she stepped into the hallway, Brandon had already sent a message asking if it was done. Ava typed back, "Yes." She did not know that behind her, Nathan remained seated for several seconds, looking not at the ring, but at the city beyond the glass, as if he had finally accepted that some people only recognize shelter after they choose the storm. Long before Ava Collins learned to call Nathan Whitmore powerful, he had been powerful in ways that left no fingerprints. 2 years into their marriage, when her mother's hospital bills began arriving in thick envelopes from Northwestern Memorial, Ava had sat at their kitchen island in West Loop with her short blonde hair clipped back and her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold. She had told Nathan not to worry, that her family would figure something out, but her voice had carried the brittle sound of a person standing too close to the edge of panic. Nathan had only nodded, loosened his tie, and asked for the account number from the billing statement. Ava thought he was helping her organize paperwork. 3 days later, the balance disappeared through a charitable assistance fund whose name meant nothing to her. Her mother cried with relief over the phone, calling it a miracle. Ava cried too, standing barefoot in the hallway while Nathan watched from the bedroom doorway, one hand resting against the frame, saying nothing. She never asked why the fund's contact address led to a private office downtown. She never noticed that Nathan skipped dinner twice that week because he was on calls with attorneys and hospital administrators. To Ava, the crisis had simply passed, and Nathan had simply been there, quiet as furniture, steady as the floor. Another winter, her father's small furniture store outside Naperville nearly closed after a supplier failed and rent came due all at once. Ava drove there on a Saturday morning, furious at the unfairness of it, embarrassed by the peeling sign above the door and the desperation in her father's smile. Nathan went with her in a gray overcoat and polished shoes, listened more than he spoke, and spent 20 minutes walking between oak tables and unfinished cabinets as if memorizing the weight of the place. That Monday, a new investor purchased the store's debt, renegotiated the lease, and brought in a local designer who helped turn the business around. Her father called it good luck. Ava called it overdue. Nathan only kissed her forehead that night and told her he was glad her father could breathe again. She did not see the wire transfer confirmation in his locked desk drawer. She did not know that Whitmore Capital Group had moved quietly through a subsidiary so her father's pride would remain untouched. There were other things too, smaller but no less costly. Nathan declined invitations to private dinners with city leaders because Ava hated eating alone. He missed a networking trip to New York because her anxiety had returned the week before her first major presentation. He sat in the back row at her business seminar, wearing a simple navy suit, applauding before anyone else, while she smiled at strangers who praised her confidence and barely glanced toward the man who had rehearsed her speech with her until midnight. When Ava wanted a life that looked brighter, Nathan bought her the light and let her believe she had found it herself. That was his mistake, perhaps. He loved like a man building a house in silence, beam by beam, never realizing the person inside might one day mistake the walls for a cage. Ava had wanted declarations, not devotion hidden in bank records. She wanted ambition she could photograph, success she could mention at dinner, a husband whose greatness entered the room before he did. Nathan's greatness usually arrived after the room was empty, after the guests had gone, after she had fallen asleep and he was still at his desk, sleeves rolled to his forearms, reading contracts beneath the soft yellow lamp beside their wedding photo. In that photo, Ava had been laughing, one hand against his chest, certain she had married a good man. Over the years, good became ordinary in her mind. Ordinary became disappointing. Disappointing became a reason to leave. On the morning of the divorce, when she called him too safe, the memories had moved behind Nathan's eyes like shadows passing over water. He could have named every sacrifice. He could have told her exactly how many doors he had opened without letting her hear the hinges. But love that has to present receipts is already standing in a courtroom. So he let the silence remain. He let her walk out believing he had given up because he had nothing worth defending. And when the elevator doors closed behind her, Nathan finally stood, slipped his empty left hand into his pocket, and carried the weight of all his unsaid kindness back into the city. Ava stepped out of the elevator that morning believing the hardest part of her life had ended, and Brandon Hayes was waiting 3 blocks away in a black sports car with the engine running and a smile polished enough to look like certainty. He had chosen a cafe near Michigan Avenue, the kind with brass lamps, marble counters, and windows so clean the city appeared more expensive through them. When Ava slid into the passenger seat, Brandon glanced at her left hand, noticed the missing ring, and said nothing sentimental. He only reached over, squeezed her fingers once, and told her she looked lighter already. The word pleased her because she needed it to be true. She needed the divorce to feel like release, not abandonment in reverse. She needed Brandon's watch, his tailored coat, his easy laughter, and the soft leather scent inside his car to prove she had stepped into a life with motion, color, and promise. That afternoon, he ordered champagne at lunch even though it was barely noon, and when the waiter asked what they were celebrating, Brandon said, "New beginnings," loud enough for the couple at the next table to hear. Ava smiled because she knew she was supposed to. She wore the smile through the salad she barely touched, through Brandon's stories about investor meetings in Miami, a private club in Dallas, a property deal in Scottsdale, and a future that always seemed to arrive wearing sunglasses and stepping out of a valet lane. He spoke in wide gestures, naming people as if names were currency, mentioning numbers that sounded impressive without ever becoming clear. Ava listened with the hunger of someone who had spent years mistaking quiet devotion for a lack of ambition. Everything about Brandon appeared visible. His success sat on his wrist, in his car keys, in the way hostesses recognized him, in the way he tipped with 2 folded bills and never looked back. By evening, Ava had posted a photograph of 2 crystal glasses beside a city view, careful not to show Brandon's face completely, careful to make the mystery look elegant. Her phone brightened again and again with messages from friends asking if she was okay, if she was happy, if that was who they thought it was. She answered selectively, always with a soft little hint, always with just enough glow to make her new life look undeniable. Within weeks, Brandon became the shape of her public recovery. He took her to rooftop lounges where the wind off Lake Michigan moved through her short blonde hair and the skyline glittered behind her like evidence. He introduced her to men in navy suits and women who laughed without wrinkling their eyes. He touched the small of her back politely as they crossed crowded rooms, not with tenderness, but with ownership disguised as manners. Ava did not notice at first. She was too busy being seen. After years of feeling that Nathan's love lived behind closed doors, she wanted a romance that entered through the front entrance with cameras flashing and a reservation under a famous name. Brandon understood that. He understood what to say when she doubted herself, what restaurant to choose when she felt lonely, what compliment to give when she wore something new. But sometimes, when she turned away, His expression changed. His attention drifted toward the men at the private tables, toward conversations about capital, mergers, hotel developments, and investment groups with locked doors. One name appeared more than once in those conversations: Whitmore. Brandon never reacted too strongly, but Ava noticed the first time his fingers paused around his glass. He asked casually whether she had ever heard of Whitmore Capital Group. Ava shook her head, almost laughing. The only Whitmore she knew was Nathan, and Nathan had never belonged to rooms like this. Brandon watched her for a second too long, then smiled and said it was probably nothing. Yet after that night, his questions changed. He wanted to know whether Nathan still lived downtown, whether he had influential friends, whether he had ever mentioned private clients or investment work during their marriage. Ava answered with the careless confidence of a woman protecting the story she had chosen. Nathan was steady, she said. Reliable. Not connected. Not that kind of man. Brandon leaned back and nodded, but there was disappointment behind his eyes, a thin shadow crossing the shine. Ava missed it, or chose to miss it. She was building a brighter life one dinner at a time, one photograph at a time, one carefully lit illusion at a time. And somewhere across the city, in an office she had never entered, Nathan Whitmore worked late beneath a brass desk lamp, signing documents that would soon bring Brandon Hayes to his door. The invitation arrived on heavy cream paper with raised gold lettering, the kind of invitation Brandon Hayes placed on a restaurant table as if it were a passport to a better class of oxygen. Ava Collins read the name of the benefit twice, while the lights of the River North dining room shimmered against the window beside her. The Langford Foundation Winter Gala. Private donors. City officials. Investment partners. Brandon watched her over the rim of his glass, studying her reaction with the relaxed confidence of a man who had already imagined himself photographed beneath the chandeliers. He told her it would be good for both of them, a night where important people could finally see what they were building. Ava wanted to believe him. She wanted the ache that sometimes followed her home after their perfect dinners to be nothing more than old grief fading in an expensive room. So on the night of the gala, she chose a black dress with clean lines, pearl earrings, and a coat soft enough to feel like protection. She cut her short blonde hair into a sharper shape that morning, telling the stylist she wanted something new, something lighter. By 7 o'clock, Brandon was waiting outside her building in a dark car, dressed in a glossy tuxedo, smiling as though the evening already belonged to him. The Langford Hotel rose above downtown Chicago with its windows glowing against the winter sky, and inside, the ballroom looked almost unreal. Crystal chandeliers hung over a marble floor. White roses filled tall glass vases. A string quartet played near the staircase while servers moved through the crowd with silver trays and quiet steps. Ava felt the old thrill of being watched as she entered on Brandon's arm. Heads turned. A woman in emerald silk complimented her dress. A councilman Brandon seemed desperate to impress, shook his hand, and gave Ava the polite smile reserved for beautiful people whose importance had not yet been confirmed. Brandon began working the room immediately, guiding her from circle to circle, speaking of development plans, waterfront properties, and an expansion proposal that only needed the right capital partner. Ava noticed how often his laugh became louder when someone mentioned funding. She noticed, too, that he kept scanning the ballroom doors. Then the lights softened, and the host stepped onto the low stage beneath a blue wash of light. Conversations thinned. Glasses lowered. The host thanked the foundation board, the donors, the volunteers, and the families whose lives would be touched by the evening. Ava listened politely, one hand resting around a flute of sparkling water she had barely tasted. Brandon leaned closer and whispered that the principal donor was someone everyone had been trying to meet for months. His voice carried excitement, but beneath it was strain. Then the host smiled toward the side entrance and said the name that emptied the air from Ava's lungs. Nathan Whitmore. For one suspended second, Ava thought she had misheard. Then the doors opened, and Nathan walked into the light in a black tailored suit, a white shirt crisp at the collar, his dark tie perfectly straight, his short brown hair neat, his face composed with the same quiet that had once made her impatient. Only now, that quiet did not look ordinary. It looked like control. The room rose before he reached the stage. Men who had ignored Brandon all evening began clapping with both hands. A bank president straightened his jacket. The woman in emerald silk leaned toward her husband, and whispered something with visible surprise. Brandon's fingers tightened around his glass until the ice shifted softly. Nathan accepted the applause with a small nod, not hungry for it, not embarrassed by it, simply aware of it in the way a man is aware of rain against a window. The host introduced him as the Chief Executive Officer of Whitmore Capital Group, the evening's principal benefactor, and a private investor whose work had reshaped several major community development projects across the Midwest. Each word struck Ava with humiliating precision. Chief Executive Officer, principal benefactor, private investor. Not safe, not small, not ordinary. Nathan stepped to the microphone and spoke for less than 2 minutes. His voice was low, steady, and without performance. He talked about rebuilding neighborhoods without erasing the people who lived there. He thanked the foundation staff by name. He did not look toward Ava, and somehow that made her feel more visible than if he had stared directly at her. Around her, people listened with the respect she had once begged him to earn in louder ways. When he finished, the applause returned, deep and immediate. Brandon set his glass down too quickly. Ava heard the faint tap against the table and turned. The confidence had drained from his face, leaving behind calculation. He knew, maybe not everything, but enough to understand that the man he had dismissed through Ava's stories was the man whose signature could decide his future. Nathan stepped down from the stage and began greeting guests. A line formed almost naturally around him. Ava stood still as the crowd moved. Memories arrived without mercy. Nathan at their kitchen island paying bills she had stopped thinking about. Nathan in the back row of her seminar. Nathan placing his wedding ring on the conference table without asking her to stay. Brandon touched her elbow and murmured that they should say hello. His voice was smooth again, but Ava felt the need inside it. When Nathan finally turned and saw them approaching, his expression did not change. Brandon extended his hand first, too eager by half. Nathan shook it with measured courtesy. Then his gaze moved to Ava. For the first time that night, she had no prepared smile. Nathan gave her a polite nod, calm enough to break something in her. "Good evening, Ava," he said, as if her name were no longer a wound, only a fact. Brandon Hayes recovered first, because men like Brandon treated embarrassment as something to smooth over before anyone else could name it. He gave Nathan a bright smile, the kind that had worked on restaurant managers, junior investors, and people who enjoyed standing near confidence. Nathan Whitmore accepted the smile without returning it fully. The three of them stood beneath the soft blue light at the edge of the ballroom, close enough to the stage that Ava could still feel the echo of applause in the floor. Around them, donors and executives drifted in careful circles, their voices low, their glasses catching chandelier light like small pieces of ice. Brandon began speaking almost immediately. He complimented the foundation, the speech, the scale of the evening, then turned the conversation toward his waterfront development proposal with a practiced ease that made every sentence sound casual and every pause sound planned. Ava stood beside him, her hand resting against the satin seam of her dress, trying not to look at Nathan too long. Nathan listened with the same calm attention he had once given her father in the old furniture store outside Naperville. He did not interrupt. He did not glance away. He made no visible judgment while Brandon described mixed-use spaces, luxury apartments, retail anchors, and projected returns that rose a little too beautifully with every phrase. When Brandon mentioned community revitalization, Nathan's eyes shifted for the first time, not sharply, only slightly, as if a quiet door had closed somewhere in his mind. Ava saw it. Brandon did not. He reached into his jacket and produced a slim folder, glossy and expensive, with the project name printed in silver across the front. "I was hoping your team might take a serious look at this," Brandon said. Nathan accepted the folder, opened it, and turned the pages with measured care. The music from the string quartet floated behind them. Someone laughed near the champagne table. Ava heard none of it clearly. She watched Nathan's hands instead, steady hands, familiar hands, the same hands that had once set a glass of water beside her bed when she worked too late, the same hands she had accused of holding nothing worth chasing. Nathan paused on one page, then another. Brandon kept talking, adding details, softening risks, polishing weak points with confident language. Nathan closed the folder before Brandon finished. The sound was gentle, but it landed between them with more force than a raised voice could have carried. Your presentation is elegant, Nathan said. The numbers are not. Brandon blinked, the smile still on his face, but no longer connected to anything real. Nathan continued in the same, even tone. The occupancy projections assume demand that your own market study does not support. The construction timeline ignores 2 pending zoning reviews. And the community impact section is written as if the existing residents are an obstacle rather than people. A small silence formed around them. It was not dramatic enough for the entire ballroom to notice, but Ava felt it spread across her skin. Brandon adjusted his cufflink, buying a second to rebuild himself. Those are early drafts, he said. Nothing that cannot be revised with the right capital behind it. Nathan looked at him then, fully and politely. Capital does not fix character in a project. It only makes the consequences more expensive. Ava lowered her eyes because the sentence was not spoken to her, but it found her anyway. Brandon's jaw tightened for just a breath before he smiled again. Of course. I appreciate direct feedback. Perhaps we could schedule a private meeting next week and go through the details properly. Nathan handed the folder back. My acquisitions team reviewed a version of this proposal last month through a broker in Dallas. We declined then. My answer tonight is the same. Brandon's hand closed around the folder too quickly. Ava turned toward him, stunned not only by the rejection, but by the fact that he had already tried to reach Nathan before this evening. Brandon had known Whitmore Capital Group mattered. He had known enough to bring her here like a key he hoped might still fit a lock. The realization moved through her slowly, cold and clean. Nathan gave a courteous nod, not triumphant, not cruel, and shifted his gaze to Ava. For a moment, she thought he might say something about the past, about her calling him ordinary, about the way she had walked away with all the certainty of someone trading up. He said nothing. That restraint was worse than accusation. It left her alone with every memory, every careless sentence, every dinner where she had wished he would become the kind of man who stood in rooms like this. Now he did, and he looked untouched by the fact that she was finally seeing him. Brandon cleared his throat and said they should let Mr. Whitmore enjoy the evening. Nathan gave another polite nod. Enjoy the gala, he said. Then he turned toward an older woman waiting to greet him, and just like that, he was gone from the conversation, absorbed by people who knew how to value him without needing a second chance. Ava remained beside Brandon with the unopened truth pressing against her ribs. Above them, the chandeliers burned bright and flawless. Around them, the city's most polished voices continued to hum. But something in Ava's new life had cracked so quietly that no one else heard it. And she understood with a sickening clarity that humiliation did not always arrive as laughter. Sometimes it arrived as a man closing a folder, telling the truth, and walking away with clean hands. The ride from the Langford Hotel to the restaurant lasted 12 minutes, but Ava felt as if she had been sitting beside a stranger for years. Brandon Hayes kept both hands low in his lap while the hired driver moved through wet downtown streets, his glossy folder resting between them like evidence neither of them wanted to touch. Outside the windows, Chicago blurred into streaks of white headlights and red traffic signals, the winter rain turning every storefront into a trembling reflection. Ava looked at Brandon once, expecting him to laugh it off, to say Nathan had been difficult, jealous, bitter, anything that would return the evening to the story she had been telling herself. But Brandon was not smiling now. His jaw worked in small movements, and the silence around him had lost its shine. At the restaurant, he chose a table near the back, away from the windows and away from people who might recognize him from the gala. The room was warm, dim, expensive, filled with low amber light and the soft clink of silverware. A waiter offered wine. Brandon ordered without asking Ava what she wanted. She sat across from him with her short blonde hair tucked behind one ear, her black dress still flawless, her pearl earrings still catching light, but all the careful elegance felt borrowed now, like a costume from a life she no longer understood. Brandon opened the folder, turned one page, then closed it again with a controlled breath. You could have warned me, he said. Ava looked up slowly. Warned you about what? About him, Brandon replied, his voice low but tight. About Nathan Whitmore being Nathan Whitmore. For a moment, Ava only stared at him. The candle between them flickered against the silverware. I did not know, she said. Brandon gave a humorless laugh and leaned back in his chair. You were married to the man. Do you understand how ridiculous that sounds? The words were not loud, but they carried enough contempt to make her hands go still in her lap. Ava thought of Nathan in their old kitchen, sleeves rolled up, reading through papers while she complained that he never talked about anything important. She thought of the nights he said he had work, and she answered with disappointment instead of curiosity. "I told you what I knew," she said. "No, Brandon said. You told me what you wanted him to be. Ordinary. Safe. Useful only as a story about what you escaped." The waiter returned with the wine, sensed the shape of the table, and left quickly. Brandon poured for himself first. Ava did not touch her glass. He lowered his voice further, but the polish had cracked. "Do you have any idea what one meeting with Whitmore Capital could have done for my project? One endorsement, one introduction, one private conversation." Ava felt something cold settle behind her ribs. "So that is why you wanted to go tonight?" Brandon looked at her as if the answer should have been obvious. "It was an opportunity. You had history with him. I assumed that meant something." "History," Ava repeated softly. The word opened inside her like a door to an empty room. Brandon rubbed his thumb along the stem of his glass. "You divorced him, Ava. Men like that do not forget women who leave. I thought maybe he would still want to impress you. I thought maybe you had some influence left." There it was, not shouted, not hidden, not softened by romance. The truth sat between them with perfect posture. Brandon had not been chasing her future. He had been chasing the shadow of a man she had thrown away. Ava looked across the table at him and saw every dinner differently, every compliment, every careful question about Nathan, every casual mention of investment groups and private capital. The beautiful life she had been displaying had not been built for her. It had been staged around what Brandon hoped she could unlock. She remembered Nathan at the gala, closing the folder without cruelty. "Capital does not fix character in a project." She had thought the sentence was for Brandon. Now she understood it had reached her too. Brandon kept speaking, explain. "Ava, be practical. This is bigger than pride." She stood slowly, placing her napkin beside the untouched glass. For the first time that evening, she did not care who saw her leave. "Pride was what made me walk away from the wrong man," she said quietly. "I will not use regret to open a door for another one." Brandon stared at her, his face hardening into disbelief, but Ava was already reaching for her coat. She stepped out into the cold Chicago rain alone. The city smelled like wet pavement and exhaust, and somewhere beyond the traffic, Nathan was moving through a life that no longer bent toward her. Ava stood beneath the restaurant awning, letting the air touch her face, and realized the ache in her chest was not because Brandon had failed her. It was because Nathan had not. He had loved her in silence, protected her in silence, and finally left her in silence. Only now, with the rain gathering at the edge of her lashes, did she understand how loud that silence had always been. No polished armor. When she finally stood in the lobby of Whip Slim File and placed it on the desk between them, he did not push it toward her with anger. He laid it down gently, as if anything heavier would have been unkind. Ava stared at the folder. "What is that?" "Some things you never asked about," he said. She opened it with careful fingers. The first page listed the hospital assistance fund that had cleared her mother's bills. The second showed the investment structure that saved her father's furniture store. Then came records of consulting fees paid anonymously to support her first business seminar, legal invoices Nathan had covered during her family's tax dispute, quiet payments, quiet rescues, quiet proof. Ava's throat closed around the breath she tried to take. The room blurred, not dramatically, just enough to make the numbers swim. "You did all of this," she whispered. Nathan looked toward the rain-streaked glass. "I did what I could for the people you loved. Why did you never tell me?" "Because I did not want your gratitude to become another bill you felt you had to pay." The answer broke something softer than pride. Ava pressed her fingers to the edge of the file, remembering every time she had called him unambitious, every time she had complained that he never did anything bold, every time he had simply absorbed the wound and stayed kind. "I was cruel," she said. Nathan did not disagree. "That mercy hurt too. You were unhappy," he said. "And instead of looking closely at why, you gave my silence the blame." Ava lifted her eyes to him then, and for the first time there was no story left. Ava remained seated long after the apology left her mouth, as if the words needed time to settle into the carpet, the walnut desk, the quiet air between them. Nathan did not rush to fill the silence. He stood by the window with one hand in his pocket, looking down at the Chicago River as rain softened the city into gray ribbons of light. From where Ava sat, His reflection appeared in the glass beside the skyline, calm and distant, the outline of a man who had stopped waiting for someone to understand him. That was what frightened her most. Not his success, not the office, not the title printed on the folder lying closed between them. It was the peace on his face. She had prepared herself for anger, for a cold sentence, for a look that would punish her. She had not prepared for a man who had already walked through the fire and learned to live without needing her to see the scars. Ava touched the edge of the file once more, then drew her hand back. The papers inside held years she could never return to him. Hospital bill, her. I loved you for a very long time, he said. His voice was gentle, and that gentleness hurt more than refusal spoken harshly. Ava nodded, but hope moved through her anyway, thin and desperate. Then maybe we could start with dinner, she said. Not tonight. Not as if nothing happened. Just someday. We could talk. We could learn each other again. Nathan breathed out slowly. Outside, a train moved across a bridge in the distance, its lights sliding through the rain like a quiet warning. There are people who only begin to see love when it no longer stands where they left it, he said. Ava looked down. I know. I am not asking you to forget. I am not even asking you to forgive me all at once. I already forgave you, Nathan said. That is not the same as returning. The sentence did not strike loudly. It simply closed something. Ava felt it in the room, in the distance between his chair and hers, in the clean surface of the desk where her fingers had once wanted to reach for him and now did not know if they had the right. Nathan came around the desk, not close enough to confuse mercy with invitation, but close enough to prove he was not hiding behind power. I spent years trying to become visible inside my own marriage, he said. And when you finally looked, it was because other people were looking too. Ava's eyes filled, but she did not cover her face. She owed him the dignity of being witnessed without making her grief the center of the room. I am sorry, she whispered again, though she knew the words were too small for what they carried. Nathan nodded. I believe you. That was the last kindness, and perhaps the hardest one. He walked with her to the elevator through the quiet executive floor. Their footsteps moved over the dark carpet in measured rhythm, not like a couple leaving together, but like two people escorting a memory to its final door. Ava pressed the button. The silver doors reflected them side by side, his navy suit and straight tie, her damp hair and tired eyes, two versions of the same story standing close without belonging to each other anymore. When the elevator arrived, she stepped inside and turned around. For one suspended second, she wanted him to stop. The doors, to say her name the way he once had in their kitchen at midnight, soft with patience. Nathan only stood there, composed, sad, and free. Take care of yourself, Ava, he said. The doors began to close. Through the narrowing space, she saw him turn back toward the office, toward the rain-lit windows, toward the life he had built without applause and now kept without apology. Ava descended alone, holding her purse with both hands, feeling every floor pass beneath her like a truth she could not undo. In the lobby, the rain had thinned. She stepped outside without calling a car right away. Across the street, office lights glowed high above the wet pavement, and somewhere behind one of those windows, Nathan Whitmore no longer waited to be chosen. He had not won because she came back. He had won because he no longer needed her return to prove he had been worth loving. Ava stood beneath the awning until the cold air steadied her breathing, then walked into the Chicago night with nothing left to chase but the person she should have become sooner.